and Dean, and our speakers here for sharing your extraordinary insights with all of us here and all of those who will listen once this goes online. I would like to just read one paragraph by Richard Feynman, if I may. It will only take about a minute, and our time here is very precious. But many mainstream scientists, which means scientists who believe that matter is fundamental and everything is derivative, or fantasy, would say that what we've been hearing, as you so well know, perhaps painfully know, that everything we've heard this morning, perhaps with the exception of the physics we've heard about, is out there on the fringe, speculative, unrealistic, mumbo-jumbo. And I think the favorite response is to ignore or to ridicule things that challenge empirically materialistic beliefs. Richard Feynman himself, one of the two great physicists of the latter half of the 20th century, himself a materialist, he has this to say, and then I'll turn it over to discussion, but I think this is a good way to start. Hardcore, brilliant physicist, Nobel laureate, but here's what he comments about the type, implicitly, about the type of research we've heard today. He said, "It is only through refined measurements and careful experimentation that we can have a wider vision. And then we see unexpected things. We see things that are far from what we would guess, far from what we could have imagined. If science is to progress, what we need is the ability to experiment, honesty in reporting results, and the results must be reported without somebody saying what they would like the results to have been. One of the ways of stopping science would be only to do experiments in the region where you know the law. But experimenters search most diligently and with the greatest effort in exactly those places where it seems most likely that we can prove our theories wrong. In other words, we're trying to prove ourselves wrong as quickly as possible, because only in that way can we find progress." So from the perspective of this brilliant Nobel laureate in physics, the kind of science we've heard today is exactly the type of science that should be mainstream science. But in fact, we see that's not the case. And so that was just, I think, to set the stage, and I guess it is a congratulation for all of you, Dean and Marjorie, people at Division of Perceptual Studies, which you know very well, for being courageous enough to challenge the accepted wisdom, which turns out to be accepted delusion. So I understand that we have 40 minutes for this session, and we have a very well-educated, astute audience, a small audience here, but of professionals, and we have our panel right here, and then I understand we'll have a bit of time to also field questions from people listening by Zoom. So I'm going to try to partition the 40 minutes so each of these groups has some time to reflect and respond to what you've heard. Maybe I'd like to turn to Professor Ray. And Professor, your last name? Chen, thank you. I should remember that. First of all, if I can just turn to you, any responses or questions you two would like to raise to our panelists here?
Thank you, Professor Wallis, and thank you, Dean, and thank you, Warlick. This is an inspirational panel, and to talk about the penetration for the materialism, for the phenomena. I would like to respond a little bit about the three stages of humankind to recognize, to knowing the word from mysticism. In the ancient time, we perceive that the world actually is dominated by the God, from Greek to ancient China, and to many, including India, before the Buddha. Everything is dominated by the God. And that's the super phenomenon that people feel, that the human mind or human being cannot control the world, as God control the world. So from mysticism, now we move to scientific era, believe that another aim is called materialism. Everything is vivid, it's substantial. We skip the super phenomena, or we skip those super nature. believe that is superstition, it's untruth. And then finally, we founded the Buddhism, teach us mind. Mind actually restructure the whole phenomena. We perceive the super phenomena, but this time it's not superstition. On contrary, it's very reasonable. We are reasonable to recognize the world actually is based on interdependent origination. So everything is from subject to object. We co-create the reality of the world. So from mysticism to materialism, and now we say the third M stage of human civilization is how can we really see the reality of mind, how the function of mind. And the mind, of course, we relate to the consciousness. But consciousness in Buddhism have two definitions. One is perception, the way we see, as like Dr. Warlick has talked about the five sensory organs. We can see, we can hear, we can smell, we can eat, we can sense. But beyond that, the consciousness actually, we can reach the state of awakening. When our conscious stay in this, the real world or material world, or based on our internal perception, we separate from the holiness. But when our mind relate to beyond the phenomena, beyond the separation, we rejoin the reality, rejoin the holiness. That's the stage of awakening. So I think mind is very good for us to knowing that we are not separate from the unity. Individual belong to the holiness, and we are the one. We belong to the holiness. Actually, we are the holiness. And that kind of a new recognition of human being, a recognition of our mind functioning is very important. And it's very important to find the evidence. We are very lucky to organize this Buddhism and Science. And this really is inspired by our CEO, Yan. He highly encouraged me to organize this conference. And aftermath, we might continue the research on how Buddhism relates to science and how science Buddhism actually can correlate it and develop a new recognition of human mind and human world. So I thank you for all this wonderful talk. And that's my feedback. I think with 3M stage, we have enter the new M arrow. Hopefully that we can work together to achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. And Dr. Shen, would you have any comments or questions to our panelists who are not, or our speakers who are not here?
So I do have a question to Dr. Rodin. So thank you very much for your great presentation. So in one of your slides, you showed that there's an experiment, two persons separate away, right? Then you somehow show they have some correlation in your experiment, right? So I would like to ask this. I think this correlation is classical correlation, right? Nothing related to quantum correlation. And the second comment is that, this is somehow similar to this Bell's inequality I've just given in my talk. And it took the physicists about 30, 40 years to rule out all this loophole in Bell's inequality. So it's quite a long time. So therefore, it took almost 40 years to say, then physicists agreed that, okay, the realism doesn't exist, right? So it's a slow step, but it's very careful. You have to take into everything into account, then really rule out all loophole. Then you can say, oh, let's really have the non-local correlation between these two parties. So therefore, I would like to ask, in this your experiments, two people separate away, are there any debate on this loophole in this experiment? Thank you.
Perhaps now you can hear me. Right? Okay. So early on in the development of these telepathy tests, there was, of course, a lot of criticism of possible flaws. In the very beginning, to develop a protocol that we knew would not have flaws, magicians, like stage magicians and illusionists, were invited to participate in the design of these experiments to make sure that methods of deception and confederates and other techniques that a magician might use to fake this kind of result, they were part of the development process. And so over the years, and going back probably 50 years or so, every time a new study was published, of course, skeptics would then publish saying, well, maybe it was this, maybe it was this flaw or that flaw. Those are the loopholes, potentially. And so up until maybe 20 years ago, there were still some skeptics who would say, well, it might be this flaw. But after that, for at least 20 years now, which in the graph that I was showing is a stable effect size, the skeptics who actually know these experiments now admit that they are unaware of any other loopholes. So both the experimenters who are doing this, and I've done these experiments myself, and severe skeptics who actually don't believe that telepathy can be real, they admit that they don't have any other loopholes that they know of. And so these are much, much easier to run than something like an entanglement experiment in physics, because you're dealing with tiny, very sensitive effects. Here, you take two people and isolate them really well. There is no way that they can communicate by any normal means, and yet what we see is similar to quantum entanglement in the sense that we never have detected any signal passing from one person to the other. But what we see is a common arising, similar to a stronger than classical correlation. That's what we see in these experiments. So it looks a lot like quantum entanglement in these experiments, whether it's done through conscious report or through things like brain activity at a distance.
Thank you very much for your comments, but I still have some, sorry, I'm playing the role of a scientist, the usual physicist. So actually there's one thing that it might be classical, not quantum, because if this two person in previously, they have engagement, so they have a common cause in the, some time ago. Then you separate them, right? Then you measure them separately. Then it can still produce the correlation. That means that before they have some engagement, they have produced some classical correlation. Then later you do this kind of experiment, you separate them. It is possible to create a correlation in your experiment. That is possible. So therefore, when we use the word quantum entanglement, we have to be very cautious because the quantum entanglement is very fragile. It's easy to destroy. So in most cases, in the room temperature case, what we left is most likely the classical information. Right? If we want to say this is around quantum, so we have to be very careful then to make sure all the information is quantum. Otherwise, I think the quantum physics would not accept this kind of claim. I'm sorry, I'm making this kind of, this comment. Thank you.
The sound will have to...
Yes. So, I'd like to address a question to Dr. Woollacott, having listened to your very fascinating presentation. And just one could get the impression that the model of consciousness you're presenting is two-tiered. There's the ordinary gut instinct or gut experiences that we have with the five senses, our experiences of our emotions and thoughts and so forth, on the one hand, which is filtered by the brain, limited by the brain. On the other hand, we have the second tier in this two-tiered model of this ultimate consciousness. And the way you described it, as I myself am a scholar of comparative mysticism, one finds resonance in multiple religious traditions around the world that would say, oh, but yes, we can relate to this. Whether it's in Sufism or Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, or Christian mysticism, it's very, very similar. And then we go to Vedanta, we go to Taoism, we go to Buddhism, especially in Mahayana Buddhism. So there we see a lot of resonance there. There's a lot of commonality. But in the two-tiered model, something is left out. And this has to do with subtle mind. Now, subtle mind you did refer to, I don't think you called it by that name, but the subtle mind was when the brain shuts down and you're still having experiences. Your eyes are blocked, your ears are blocked, but you are seeing the environment in the room. And you know there are many cases like this that you can't dismiss. If you're a scientist and open-minded, you can't dismiss. And in some cases, people who've had that experience said, my experience during that case was more vivid, more intense than ordinary experience. But it's not brain-based. But it's certainly not ultimate consciousness either. And in the Tibetan Buddhist view, or in Indian and Tibetan Buddhist view, in fact, there's a three-tiered model. There's our ordinary consciousness, of which we're very familiar. There's the ultimate consciousness, the mystical consciousness, yes. But there is what Dr. Chen referred to as subtle mind. And he raised, I think, a very interesting connection that I'd never heard of before. But subtle mind is what's there when you're having these out-of-body experiences, near-death or post-death experiences. And this relates very closely to the brilliant research, which has not been mentioned today, by Dr. Ian Stevenson, the late Dr. Ian Stevenson, that began like 50 years ago and continued with Jim Tucker and others at the Division of Perceptual Studies. Now, in Dr. Stevenson's book, where reincarnation and biology intersect, he speaks not only of dozens, scores of cases of children who have veridical memories of past lives that cannot be accounted for in any other way in a reasonable fashion. But what they also came up with is quite a number of these individuals had clear past life recollections, also recalled experiences after death and prior conception in this lifetime. Now this is called the bardo in Tibetan Buddhism or Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, a transitional phase which is not ordinary consciousness, it's not ultimate consciousness, and it is individual. So then we have a three-tiered model, and that hasn't come up today, at least explicitly. But what Dr. Chen raised, I think, a very intriguing point, and perhaps you, Dr. Radin or Dr. Ullicott, could respond. This whole issue of instantaneous transformation of information. And then he raised the possibility, it's a question, but I think a very interesting question. Might this be related to subtle mind? You can't make sense of it in terms of coarse mind. It's prior to and more primitive than this ultimate consciousness. But in the Buddhist understanding, which began with the Buddha himself and corroborated in the last 20, 30 years by this excellent research at the University of Virginia, beings in this intermediate period, this bardo period, they can move instantaneously. They may be having an experience here, in this room here in Tainan, and then instantaneously they're thinking about Chicago. And in an instant, their consciousness is now experiencing something in Chicago. Now I know that Russell Targ has done a lot of research on remote viewing or clairvoyance, and it turns out it doesn't matter if the target that you're viewing remotely is 100 yards away or 100 miles away. It makes no difference. There's no inverse square law that gives you greater accuracy if it's closer. But now with the telepathy that you spoke of, Dr. Ullicott, and this subtle mind and entanglement and instantaneous transfer of information, this is what is experienced in that intermediate period. It's not ultimate, it's not mystical. It's just what happens to consciousness after death and prior to the next conception. So these are simply some observations, a question raised by my esteemed colleague that I'd never thought of. But Dr. Radin, Dr. Ullicott, would you have any comments about this intermediate level of consciousness that is not human, but is not cosmic or ultimate or divine either? Either one of you would like to respond. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Easy to hear, but I think that it's an interesting paradox that you're talking about, because many people have these experiences while they're embodied, but we are still saying that it's subtle mind. So I think that you're reminding us that we need research that carefully tries to distinguish between something that's embodied but is telepathy across thousands of miles, etc., versus that experience which is now non-embodied, whether it's a reincarnation or a near-death experience when the mind and the body are not functioning. And I don't know whether it is perhaps a continuum along that line, all the way maybe to ultimate reality, or whether there really are any demarcations. So that would be my first question that I would ask of researchers trying to look at these three states: embodied, subtle mind, and then universal mind. That's a very important point. I think that what it seems to be is that there is a continuum from talking with people that have, for example, the work of Diane Powell now on these nonverbal savants that have absolute telepathy with significant others, where it's pretty much 100% that they're correct, not just 30%, but 100%. Where is that along the body, subtle mind continuum? I'm not absolutely sure. I was, in fact, talking to somebody that's on our Skype or our Zoom today, Jeb Barton, about these children and whether there is something going on in their ability where, on the one hand, they are children acting like they have a normal childhood in a body, and on the other hand, they're in the subtle mind where they are giving us information from other realms. It's like, my own understanding is that this is truly a paradoxical, interpenetrating state in the living human being. Maybe in reincarnation, after you've left the body, it's very different, and then it's only subtle mind. For example, I'm not really sure, but I'll at least throw that out right now in terms of trying to say, what research could we do to try to really look at this continuum and see if there are clear demarcations?
Is to clarify about the Ganzfeld telepathy method, that the targets that are being sent, even if the two people involved are identical twins and have very similar backgrounds and know their own biases and so on, the targets are selected randomly, and no one knows beforehand what the target is. So things like common knowledge can't explain this outcome. It's also the case that very long distance studies have used similar methods, and again, it doesn't seem to matter what distance there is. Regarding the idea of subtle mind, I think virtually all of the experiments that have been done on these kinds of phenomena must include something like that, because people are asked to do something. So they're not very, if you think of this as a spectrum of different states we can be in, the states that people are in these experiments generally are very close to ordinary states, because they're asked to do something and respond and do things like a human would do. When we see these apparent, I don't want to say transfer of information because we don't see signals. When we see a rising of information, that's probably one step away from the ordinary human state, but it's certainly not anywhere near as far as being in a state of universal oneness. Because in that state, I don't think somebody could actually do an experiment. We see this, for example, when people who have psychedelics will sometimes say that they get into a state where they have complete telepathy with everything. But in that state, they don't want to do an experiment. Like, doing an experiment is the last thing in the world that they want to do. So we're kind of constrained to work at sort of quasi-human state in order to do experiments on these things. And it's then very difficult to move up the ladder, so to speak, to do experiments that would be really fascinating to do, but we'd have to work with people who are extremely experienced in those states and can still operate somewhat like a human in order to do the experiment.
I'll give you an analogous situation. In 1992, I was in Dharamsala, India, with a very distinguished group of neuroscientists, Richard Davidson, Francisco Varela, Cliff Saran, and with the blessing of His Holiness Dalai Lama, we were encouraged to go up into the mountains above Dharamsala, where there were Tibetan yogis who've been living in solitude in meditation for 10, 20, 30, 35 years of intense meditative training for decades on end. And I remember one of them that we interviewed, because I was the interpreter for all of these neuroscientists. We came to one of the yogis, and this relates to your point, Dr. Radin, just now. And we came to one of these yogis that may be up there for 20 years. And I was the interpreter, and I asked him, well, these scientists would like to study your brain, your behavior when you're in a meditative state. Would you be willing to collaborate with them? And he said, no. And I said, well, why not? Because these scientists, they're totally enmeshed in materialism, and whatever I say, they will interpret it in a materialistic sense. What is the brain doing? Because the mind is a function of the brain. And I refuse to support that view, because it's delusional. So then a question, maybe a final one for me right now, but there's so much time we could spend just in this one panel. But Dr. Radin, you mentioned these 4 areas. See if I can pull them out right here. Of the 4, there it is, yes. Telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. And you've commented that you have just, for one type of study, randomly selected, college students or what have you, another study, artistics. But what is widely known, especially in Asia, in the Hindu tradition going back 3,000-4,000 years, the Buddhist tradition, 2,600, the Taoist tradition, about the same, is that these are not just qualities that people have 34% of the time, but in fact, these are qualities that can be cultivated in very reasonable, intelligent, rational methods, but it takes intense discipline and months or years of intense training for people who have no such abilities apart from just normal statistical ability, but they can train them to the point that their accuracy rate goes from 34% to 50%, 90%, and so forth, that all of these can be trained. We don't have much of that in the Western contemplative traditions anymore, but this is really a very important aspect, not as the goal of meditative practice, but as a skillful means. And that is, if you have developed exceptional abilities through intensive training, especially of attention, then your ability to engage in telepathy can be enhanced. Remote viewing, clairvoyance, precognition, cutting through time into the future, and psychokinesis, all of these can be very useful, very beneficial in awakening other people to the potential of their own mind. So would you see this as maybe one of the next steps in the kind of research you're doing, and Russell Targ and many of the others have done, that not simply accept the statistical, this is one chance out of, a billion, trillion, what have you, but it can be trained so that it becomes something more normal. Is this something that's considered in the circles, in the fields of your research?
It is true that when we do experiments and select people who are meditators, long-term meditators, while they're not explicitly trying to develop these abilities, they generally do much better than people who are not meditators. Now, part of the joke here is that most of our studies have been done in Northern California, and it's fairly easy to find meditators. It is really difficult to find people who have never meditated. So
the Bay Area, what can one say?
A reversal of what you'd expect. But as far as the statistics, one of the reasons why we use unselected college sophomores is because we want to see are these abilities true for the general population? Is it like every human has the capacity to be able to perform these, even at a very low level, and even if they don't even know that they can do it? The answer is yes. That then says, yeah, if you train a lot, and probably if you have talent, because it's also true that not every meditator is going to be able to get to the same level, regardless of how much they practice. So talent and practice definitely will improve these abilities. So one of the projects that we're doing now is looking at what is the talent? Where does talent come from? A big component of it is genetics. So we have an experiment that's been running for a couple of years now to look at the genetics of people who are naturally psychic. And we do find that there are differences between them and the control cases of people who may be psychic, but at such a low level that they're not aware of it.
I will respond very briefly to that, and then I'd like to open up questions to our audience here, maybe 20 people or so. I can just need to respond to that point. From a scientific perspective, one would naturally look to genetics. Was your mother, your father, your grandfather, did they have such abilities? I'll respond from a Buddhist perspective, not in any way denying the influence of genetics, but from a Buddhist perspective, what have you been doing over the last 10 lifetimes? And we find the whole tradition of tulkus for 1,000 years in Tibet, people who have engaged in very intensive, prolonged meditative practice in past lives. And they come into this lifetime. And very often, like the Dalai Lama himself, when he was interviewed at the age of 30 and plucked out possessions of the 13th Dalai Lama, unerringly, 100%, he came in, not genetically, his parents were nothing particular, but his past life experiences brought tremendous momentum from many, many lifetimes in Tibet and prior to India by his own account. And that also is an influence that would be hard to study scientifically, but nevertheless, from a contemplative perspective, undeniable. So maybe briefly from you, Dr. He, and then we'll turn to our audience here.
I have a feedback to Dr. Arding and one question to Woolacott, Dr. Woolacott, is that I really appreciate Dr. Arding's experiment and research, because the advantage of science is that the science is really repeatedness. It's common, not special experiences. You can share, not exclusive. Okay, and it's also pretty objective, not subjective. So, as you're saying that you want to find the pattern, that every individual might have this ability to communicate with conscience. The conscience penetrate the space and penetrate the time. We can live different lives, and you can see the afterlife and previous life, and it also penetrates the individuals. So, but that kind of consciousness, according to Jung, he invented the theory of synchronization by his clinical treatment. He found out that synchronization did exist, that people's conscience simultaneously, the other people can resonate your conscience or your ideal. And what I'm trying to say is that we don't follow scientific method. Quantum physics or quantum entanglement might be the one to explain this synchronization. But think of this. The synchronization of consciousness may be beyond the quantum physics. I'm a background of philosophy. We don't try to apply science to prove Buddhism or to prove the existence of conscience. In the other way, the Buddhist philosophy or the research of consciousness might guide and inspire scientists to discover new theory and new phenomena. So it's one way or the other. We don't really follow the pattern of scientific discovery. On the contrary, we might guide them and lead them. And the design for this experiment, because a lot of empirical study talking about afterlife, previous life, near-death experiences, but most scientists do not adopt that because it's not common. You cannot share. You belong to a specific individual, not for everyone. So the design of research must be common, must be shared, and must be repeatedness. So, I encourage and continue this kind of research. I would like to support or we collaborate in due course. And one question for Dr. Woolacott about your presentation taught us that our brain function will limit our cognition, or brain cognition actually is limited and cannot see the holiness. When the meditation decreases the function of brain in some part of brain, will enable us to really have the consciousness reveal and reconstruct the whole new world, to recognize that reality actually is interdependent. So my question could be very, very new to you, is that due to Tzu Chi Foundation is emphasized on compassionate altruism, we have a lot of empirical experiences saying that doing the altruistic action, we actually reach some kind of holiness in compared to meditation. So were it possible for you to conduct research in due course, how the compassionate altruism will enable our consciousness reveal and a better recognition of holiness and decrease the brain limitation? Would it be possible for another future research on that? Thank you.
people have noticed now for, I think, many years that simply by meditating, whether we're meditating on compassion or meditating simply to quiet the mind, that the feeling of unity with people around us, with the world around us, gets stronger and stronger, and therefore compassion automatically arises. I think it's interesting that in one experimental study, when they compared compassion meditation to simply regular quieting the mind meditation, they both increased compassion and a sense of wanting to care for others, altruism. So, in fact, just what we're talking about today, Buddhism and these other particular philosophies that focus on quieting the mind, make you feel interconnected and make you want to care for others and the planet. So I think that certainly more and more can be done on that. But I think, like with Dean Braden's work on telepathy, there is so much evidence that meditation, contemplative practices changes the way we treat others and the planet. I do not understand why it's hard to get that across to more people in society that are controlling education and like things. So you are absolutely right. And I'm hoping we can spread consciousness education, quieting the mind education to more and more people within the world so that this can really be instantiated.
Questions over to our audience right here. It relates to a point you made earlier and then the one from Dr. Hare just now. That is, if we look at this three-tiered model, ordinary cogitation, as long as we are caught up in entangled in, immersed in, enmeshed in self-centered rumination, then abilities of clairvoyance and so forth are basically snuffed out or obscured, and likewise concern for others. Because the mind is just filled with I, me, mine, and I, me, mine. So whether one is cultivating meditatively compassion or cultivating samadhi, quieting the mind, focusing the mind, in both cases, the self-centered rumination diminishes, and in the clearing of the clouds of that, then the light of compassion and empathy is much more likely to flow out. So, and then we go to the subtle mind, and even there, transitioning through this intermediate period, there's still a grasping to one's own individual stream of consciousness. Plato spoke of this, and how one yearns to be re-embodied once again. One is desperate to be re-embodied once again, and it's individual. But when one releases that self-grasping, even in the bardo, releases that and cuts through to see the emptiness of any separate inherent existence of that subtle stream, that's exactly when you cut through to the ultimate time and space transcending consciousness. And all three are occurring simultaneously. So that's a Buddhist view. Now we have a very, may I say, enlightened audience here, and we have a few more minutes. Any questions or comments to our panelists here? Please, and if there's a mic, I'll give you mine. Anyone from here? Oh, we have a mic there? Or if not, time is... Okay, one, please.
Hello, I have a question for Dr. Radin, and it's a tactical question in regards to the experiment that you described. You mentioned that ping pong balls are used to seal the eyesight of the subjects. And I was wondering, that seems like quite a difficult task compared to, say, a normal blindfold. So what were the considerations and maybe the attributes of ping pong balls that made that the chosen object of choice? Thank you.
That's a very good question. The primary reason is that you want a translucent hemisphere over the eye while the eye is open. And so blindfolds are usually designed so that it's completely black. In this case, you don't want it to be blacked out. You want so that the eye is open and is only seeing red. And that's what creates this continual low-level stimulation that prevents the person from falling asleep. Because if you get somebody and they're wearing headphones and a mask and they're in a comfy chair, most adults over the age of 18 are just going to fall asleep. So this is why there's this constant low-level stimulation used in this experiment to keep somebody around a hypnagogic level, that they're in a twilight state between awake and asleep. and it pulls you away from ordinary waking consciousness. That's why that method is used. It also is a kind of a ritual. Person knows that this is a very unusual thing to do. They see the ping pong ball and then it's taped over the eyes. All of that is part of the ritual of the experiment to move the person from the ordinary mundane world into doing something unusual. And that's a psychological trick, essentially, that we use in the experiment to get people out of thinking this is ordinary. They're allowed to do something that's non-ordinary. So some of that is providing permission to the person to do something, whether they think they can do it or not.
Very briefly, this is fascinating from the Buddhist perspective, because going back to the time of the Buddha himself, he would very commonly say, and now place your mindfulness in front of you. Don't close your eyes. And this echoes all the way through to the Mahamudra, the Dzogchen traditions in Tibetan Buddhism. Don't close your eyes. You'll be reinforcing the sense that you're inside your head, which you're not. Place your awareness in the space in front of you, and then whatever meditation you want to do, but it brings in the spaciousness from the beginning and counteracts the notion that mind is localized and behind your eyeballs. We have just one more minute because we're trying to be punctual and courteous to our organizers here. Any closing comments from anyone? It can be encapsulated in 60 seconds.
I have a question to ask Dr. Chen. What's your opinion about this so-called quantum consciousness?
I think this is as a physicist, is not easy to answer. So, but as I said, I would like to add additional comment on this instantaneous stuff. So I think the physicists believe now that the classical information is still limited by the speed of light. So classical information is limited. Only quantum information can, teleport instantaneously to the other place. And the second thing is that I just mentioned there's no cloning theory, right? So I think we all agree that every individual is unique, right? You cannot create Dr. Chen identity 100%, right? So therefore, according to the law of quantum mechanics, if some information inside me is unknown, right, then you cannot copy, right? That makes everyone is unique, according to law of quantum mechanics, no cloning theory, right? So I personally think if consciousness is related to, compatible with quantum physics, it has something to do with quantum information, right? You have to explain to compatible with the current theory. And this is my 2 cents. Thank you.
Learn a lot from today's discussion, and still I have tons of questions, and I cannot pick one to ask. However, I'm still pretty. Actually, Ted and I, we have come interested on this quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and also we are engineering background. We'd like to see, with the modern science, can step by step to support the theory of what you mentioned, many mysterious theory from Buddhism. Yeah, that is. Actually, I've been practicing meditation for years, and I have some experience on that. However, I would discuss with Dr. Chen Yuannan after the meeting, and I would save that question for Ted. Ted, he actually spent a lot of times on this area. Ted, would you like to take the question for him? He actually had more than 60 pages slides on this area. Ted, please.
Well, I am not an expert. I'm just an amateur, just someone who's just interested in this as I was exploring what life is. And so the the discussion this morning was been wonderful. I think it really breaks out of the current paradigm of science. And I just want to raise one more question, perhaps just food for thought, that from my understanding of the quantum phenomena, I'm looking at the non-locality and simultaneity of quantum entanglement and wave function collapse across space. I think this is a hint to us. I think many of you here probably already know this, but that space or distance is not something that's real. And this is a hint to us that when we talk about like the transfer of information across space, what if there is no space? And all of this 3D, three dimensions of space is just a mathematical construct that
wormhole, theory, and there is no distance if you use a wormhole, 虫洞.
What if there's no distance at all? There's no space at all, but everything is just what we constructed based on the information, based on the stimulus that our consciousness perceives. So that could help us understand, I think, mysteries of quantum physics and how it relates to consciousness. Thank you.
I always want to make comment on Ted's description is that the space right here is not unreal, but it's relative. From Buddhist teaching, it's relative. It's real, but it's changed, by our recognition, by our cognition. So the space here is real, but it's uncertain. It's relative. It can be changed by our cognition.
Time to wrap up. This conversation could go on for a very long time, but I think we want to be courteous to our hosts. We'll be going to your laboratory. Thank you, Dr. Radin and Dr. Woollacott, for your wonderful presentation, participation in this conversation. I wish we had more time, but we do for other things. So thank you all, and we'll be back.
Thank you to the moderator and all panelists for an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Would the panelists and moderator stay on stage, and we'll take a photo with our participants online. And if Dr. Radin is still online, yes, thank you for being on camera with us. Thank you, everyone. We now invite you to join a short tour of the Center for Quantum Frontiers of Research and Technology, hosted by Dr. Chen. Please, and we will reconvene for lunch at 11:45.